Today, let them eat cake. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to the latest post covering finance and property news with a distinctively Australian flavour. And I'm joined today by Tarric Brooker, journalist. Hello, Tarric.
G'day, Martin. How are you?
Yeah, hanging in there. Yourself?
Oh, the same, mate. I think that's all you can do in this environment.
It is a bit like take one day at a time and then see what happens the next day. Repeat.
Yeah, everything just changes so quickly. You get like the littlest piece of news, and then everyone just starts. The entire game changes, and then you go, "Oh, it's not true." Back to where we were before.
I have never seen the lemmings running so fast from point A to point B to point C and then back to point A again. It is remarkable, and I guess it's partly because nobody else has got anything to do, so there's plenty of people chasing ideas. But there's something weird going on in terms of, even the smallest piece of non-news sets the herd running, doesn't it?
It is absolutely fascinating to watch. Like this, there was this clinical trial by a company called Gilead in America, and they're talking about this very effective treatment, and it's all well and good. Like you look at the market and it just went the moment this news came out. But then when you actually get down into the nitty gritty and you hear it's like, well, more people are dying on this drug than die in an Australian hospital with the same issue. And then you've also got the same thing in terms of 25% of people have serious problems, including like multiple organ failure, or issues like 23% of them end up with liver damage. So it's like the cure is potentially worse than the disease. And the market's rallying, and you've got all these medical professionals. Even the company itself put out a warning a few hours ago saying this is not statistically significant data. This is purely anecdotal, and we will have more actually, clinically significant data later this month. But this isn't a big deal. But the markets—they're not hearing that. They just said woo, and off to the races once more.
Well, the point is, you see, that not many people outside the area of science understands the scientific method and understands the clinical testing regimes that actually work through, right? So effectively, they sort of have this glimpse of an idea that sounds as though it could be the silver bullet. And unfortunately, 9 out of 10 silver bullets aren't. They end up not being airborne at all, or worse still, they do more damage than you might think. And of course, it's interesting, there's about 70 different vaccines now being trialled around the world at various stages of testing, and the first thing they do is to make sure they don't kill people.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right. I mean, I think that's a fairly important thing for a vaccine to do, to not kill people and to not, leave them with permanent kidney or liver or whatever damage it is. But I mean, I understand, this is for a lot of these people in these severe cases, it's a Hail Mary. It's let's try it and hope for the best. And in purely through that lens, I absolutely understand. You're better off, having a crack and ending up in a horrible position than ending up dead. I get that 100%. But in terms of being something that is like, as you say, a silver bullet, something that's going to be able to we can give to every man, woman, and child who ends up contracting, this virus, then it's not going to work.
Well, the key point, of course, is that if you go back to SARS, right, they spent a long time trying to work on a virus vaccine for SARS, and they never found one, right? They went through various different mechanisms. So there is still no vaccine for SARS. And unfortunately, the current virus has many of the same characteristics of the SARS virus. So it may well be that a really good vaccine will never be found.
No, it may take far longer than we expect. There are these studies going around at the moment saying that without intermittent social distancing, without intermittent closures of businesses and the closures of large-scale human interactions, whether it's conferences or concerts or sporting events or any of those sorts of things, they may not return until 2022 or later, and that's well and truly on the table. And I think that's something that's really important to remember for the markets and for politicians, because there's no guarantees. They can say 12 to 18 months, but in reality, as you say, we don't know.
No, and that 12 to 18 months may or may not be there. Look, I think that the truth is the only way that you're going to actually get this sorted out in the short term is to go to zero. In other words, stamp the virus out in as a geographic area, be it New Zealand or Australia or whatever, right? But that, of course, means then if you do that, you may be able to bring the local economy back together a little bit, but you will still have to have border barriers, because until everybody around the whole world goes through the same process, it's always going to be there.
Yeah, I don't think that's what they're going to pursue, to be honest. If they may pursue it in New Zealand, because they're very, very much into elimination rather than suppression. But here in Australia, looking at some of the plans coming out of National Cabinet, and from what I've heard from a few sources, although to be honest, everything at the moment is so fluid, I would take everything with an absolute truckload of salt, because things can change very, very quickly. But from what I've heard, we may see some relaxation of measures in South Australia towards at the start of next month, because they're showing relatively good testing rates per capita, and the government wants to do a test in a state whereby if there is a large outbreak, we can send resources to South Australia, and the larger population centres in Sydney or Melbourne or in Brisbane or wherever, we can send them our resources, but we don't have a large-scale outbreak in an unmanageable population size, so we will lag them. But I think one of the key things is a lot of people, you see it in the media, they're saying, everything's going to be back to normal by May or by June or whenever. And one, we have no idea. We have absolutely no clue. If they relax measures in the US and all of a sudden cases take off again, the narrative could change overnight. And even the numbers that I've seen coming out of National Cabinet is, if they do go ahead with this in South Australia, what we'll see is the reopening of certain businesses, and maybe to some degree some pubs and restaurants, but very, very wide social distancing, very, very wide. And that is going to go on for about 4 to 8 weeks. Then once that passes without incident, then they're looking at 8 to 16 weeks of social distancing, with gatherings limited to 50, and the 1.5 meter bubble, I suppose you could call it, being relaxed. Now, that means we're realistically looking at some point around about sometime in October, if the longer version of that timeline is realized. And that's hardly, sort of end of May, start of June, as some people are suggesting.
Well, it's interesting. Look, I mean, you can look at all the different people talking about it. I actually go for Norman Swan from the ABC, because I actually think he's got his finger on the pulse here. And he makes the point that, if you did actually really drive towards zero, you could almost get there in a few weeks, right? Because we're quite close to that now. So rather than take the foot off the brake, what we should be doing is taking that extra step a la New Zealand and aiming for zero, because if you can do that, then you have a much shorter path to dealing with bringing the economy back online. The trouble is that if you go the other route and do a little bit of relaxation, see what happens, you're basically turning the knob up a little bit, hope it doesn't go wrong, but you may well have to turn it back down again and actually basically tighten down again. And so there is this horrible scenario where you get a rippling effect, where effectively the infection rates rise, so you then tighten, and then have to sit there and then loosen, tighten, and it goes on and on and on. And I think that actually has the potential to be way more debilitating for the economy than actually going through a specific targeted process to get to zero and then effectively come out the other side. And, my own view, and I've looked at a few different scenarios and some of their modeling and things, that's the one that's beginning to look to me as though it could be doable here, given the low level of cross-infections we're getting at the moment. But it has to be a really deadly intent, otherwise it ain't going to happen.
No, I think part of the problem is it is such a difficult thing to accomplish, and a single slip-up could mean all of that effort, all of those lockdowns are for naught. And, I mean, recently a cargo ship docked, I believe it was in Sydney, with a crew that was infected with coronavirus, and 2 of the dock workers got the virus. Now, one, they broke the government's own quarantine laws of staying, outside of an affected area for 14 days. But that's been, I've been reporting on that for a few months now, and that's been happening for a while now. They've just been ignoring those regulations. Border Force has just waving people on through. But if something like that does then occur under a circumstance where we are pushing for zero, all of a sudden, if it's not caught in time, the entire cycle starts all over again. And I think that's one of the reasons why they're a little bit concerned about pressing for that, because they put all of their eggs in one political basket, and if it blows up in their face, they're going to look all manner of stupid, and we're going to be basically back where we are today. And I think
but wouldn't you agree that even if you went for the other option, which is to try and open the throttle a little, you've still got to be much more active with regard to testing and much more active at policing the borders, because whichever way you go, you can't allow this to come in from overseas. No. So in a way, I'm not sure that the path between going to zero and turning it up a little bit or down a little bit in a particular location is actually that different initially. You've still got to take those same basic precautions at the borders.
No, you're not wrong. I mean, I think that we really do need to see testing numbers ramped up significantly. I mean, they're talking about testing numbers being ramped up in New South Wales to 5,000, I believe it was yesterday. But they did nearly 9,000 tests about 2 weeks ago. And there is well and truly scope for expansion of the testing regime. Now, I don't know if there are logistical challenges in terms of a limited number of test kits or if there was some sort of, additional staff available to create such a high result when cases were near their daily peak. But we do need a completely different regime if I'm going to contain this. Like, in America, where they're talking about relaxing measures, they're talking about doing temperature screenings at restaurants. They're talking about doing temperature screenings at schools. They're talking about doing randomized testing, all these different things. Now, Australia has been extremely lucky, and we have made some good decisions. We made a lot of bad ones, but we have been very, very lucky. Now, we need to be following the US and all these other countries. People keep saying we need the Singapore option. Well, we're not doing the Singapore option. We've never been doing the Singapore option. If you want to go into a shopping mall in Singapore or most other places in Asia, you need to get your temperature screened, and you need to do the whole hand sanitizer thing before you enter. Now, we don't have any of that. And that's something that really does need to occur, that needs to change in our daily lives. That's a relatively minimal impact on how we go about our lives, but a profound impact on catching these cases before they become a problem and before we see these spreads. And as we go to Singapore once more, they've got over 400 cases a day now. Things are exploding there now. And that could very, very easily be us if they make the wrong choices.
Well, especially, of course, as we go into winter. So, the chances are that there will be more spread then. But what about this idea of the app? Because they seem to be hanging quite a lot of focus on this idea that millions of Australians will download an app and will allow their movements to be tracked. What do you think about that?
I think it's a gross violation of our civil liberties. They're talking about it potentially not being voluntary. Now, if people want to make a decision to give the government their information, it's a free country. They can make that choice. Nobody's forcing them. But if we're compelled to do this, and let's face it, it's going to have, or even if it's an opt-out sort of thing, and everyone gets a message on your phone and it just says download this app, I don't think that's a road that we should go down, to be honest. And at the end of the day, if people are going to do the wrong thing, they're going to do the wrong thing. Having an app on your phone isn't going to make someone all of a sudden turn around and decide to be a law-abiding citizen. It's a little bit, and in a way, I suppose it's a little bit akin to the cash ban. We're gonna solve the problem of criminality by making it more criminal. It's like, well, that's not how it works.
Yeah, well, you're right, and there are some really important trade-offs between civil liberties and freedoms, and the need to try and stamp the virus out. I also am with you in terms of, I think that would be a bridge too far if it said thou shalt, and you can't go out unless you've got the app on your phone, unless you've got your phone with you. That would seem to me to be extremely authoritarian, and I understand why people might want to argue that way, but it seems to me that there are other options that should be being considered. And I still want to make sure that at the end of this, whenever we come back to something like normal, we haven't in the process given up all of our civil liberties and all of our ability to keep our activities private and all those things, because I can tell you something for nothing, we'll never get them back if we've given them up.
No, we won't. All we have to do is go to an airport to know exactly how long these emergency measures stay in place. You go into an airport these days, you get, there's all these screenings and body scans and stuff that for anyone who traveled before 9/11 would say, they were completely unnecessary. And even to be completely honest with you, just on that point, even with those things, you see people walking through customs or walking through security with some of the craziest crap sometimes. Just a personal anecdote. A while ago I was going through Melbourne Airport, and there was this bloke, and he had literally almost an entire kitchen set in his carry-on luggage. He had a big pair of kitchen scissors and a big carving knife, and he's like, "I've got to make my flight." But it's ridiculous. Once we give up those liberties, we never get them back. That's never happened outside wartime. I think that's something that's really needs to be made clear by the government, and I think we need to make clear to the government this is like a wartime environment. This is temporary. We are getting our civil liberties back, because if not, we're going to come at them.
Yeah, well, that's right. And of course, in the UK, for example, where they've actually gone relatively hard on these things, they have put a time frame within which it will operate, but then effectively a drop dead date when it's actually wound back, which I think makes sense. So at least you know that it's not going to be permanent. But I have a nasty feeling that there will be powers that be around the place that think this is a great opportunity, and never lose the opportunity to use a crisis to get what you want.
Absolutely. I mean, you just got to look at the world, and you've got to say, we are heading for a profound period of change. This sort of economic strife will always result in massive social upheaval and change on a global scale. Yes, it can be isolated to certain countries, and it can be worse in others. But that is generally, historically, how it plays out. Now, why would they waste an opportunity to grab more of our civil liberties and give themselves more of ability to suppress dissent? I know that some people are going to watch this and they're going to go, "Oh, that's just a conspiracy theory." But all I can say is, look at the Patriot Act in the US. That was put in place because of 9/11, because of terrorism. They haven't had a single major Islamic terrorist attack on that scale, on anything approaching that scale, in years. There is no justification for the continuation of the Patriot Act, but it remains in place with bipartisan support from both sides of politics. Now, if we give our civil liberties up, I can't see them being given back, especially in this environment.
Yeah, no, I agree, unfortunately. And, these liberties were hard won over many generations, and essentially can be lost very quickly. And we end up, in a worst case scenario, with a digitally surveilled community that effectively has no freedoms.
And I think one of the key points is that realistically, you look at all these sort of, WikiLeaks and all these things coming up from, Facebook and all these other apps. It's all the surveillance is realistically in a lot of ways the scaffold is already there. All they need is the ability and the legislation to switch it on. You're already seeing it in China. Their smartphones aren't any different than our smartphones. All you need to do is just have the app and flip the switch, and then that's it. Game over.
Yep. No, you're right. The infrastructure is already there. The connectivity is already there. It's all just about the political will to turn it on or not turn it on, and how you frame it with the public so that they don't actually throw up their hands in horror and just roll over and accept it.
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, that's really just really the crux of the issue at the moment. That just the people, people are frightened. People are scared. They're concerned about the future, and this is the time when politicians strike. When people are afraid. Like the Patriot Act was rushed through before most people had a chance to read the first 50 pages, let alone the entire legislation. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. I mean, I hope and pray that we are making a mountain out of a molehill, and that and everything is just going to go back to the way it was before. But time will tell.
And what about the fact that Parliament isn't sitting at the moment? Do you think that's a reasonable course of action, or is there sufficient parliamentary review of what's going on at the moment? What do you think?
No, there isn't. Absolutely not. I mean, Parliament. Scott Morrison did say yesterday that Parliament will be returning sooner than expected, which is definitely a positive development. But I don't think they should have been allowed to end Parliament the way they did. You know, they've asked, teachers to stay in schools. They've asked businesses to stay. Employees to stay at businesses. Why should they be any different? I realise that there are logistical challenges, especially being in a large indoor space. But by the same token, I'm sure they're our leaders. They're meant to be clever. I'm sure they come up with a way, for people to vote from their offices or to vote from wherever, or for them to, telecast question time, whatever it is. I'm sure they could have found a way. I mean, it's sat during the war. I'm sure they could find a way to make it work, but they didn't. And that's not really any different to what Scott Morrison's been doing anyway. We've already seen him deliberately limiting the number of sitting days in Parliament to the point where everyone's just sort of wondering, why are we paying you like $6,000 per sitting day to basically, just yell and scream at each other like you usually do. So,
yeah, well, it's just amazing to me that we seem to have just accepted that that was the right course of action. My own view is there isn't a sufficient parliamentary review, and there should be much stronger questioning of what's going on. I'm afraid the opposition is pretty weak here as well. Every time Alba gets wheeled out, I don't really get any insights from him. He's just sort of a pale reflection of what's already going on.
No. I mean, to be honest, from a political perspective, I sort of understand. He's in a very difficult time. All of a sudden, the Liberal Party has adopted all these policies that were the dream of the Labor left just a few weeks ago, realistically. And there's not really a whole lot he can do. But by the same token, when it comes to things like civil liberties and stuff like that, he should be making a very, very active effort, because the reality is, for the longest time, these things are going to continue. They can't end JobKeeper. They can't end the job seeker bonus. All these things are going to be in place for the foreseeable future. They say, they're going to be over within 6 months. Yeah, no, I don't think so. The legislated time limit, according to the Treasury drafts, is actually September 30th, which is correct, but not this year, for 2021. So, they've already managed to put that in place. So there's never going to be another parliamentary debate about it, not for 18 months anyway. So, realistically, all those things are going to be in place for the foreseeable future. So Labor really needs to find something to differentiate themselves on, because if not, they're just standing there going, yep, yep, yep. And that's not exactly inspiring, the Labor faithful, and nor is it really, creating any sort of positivity. A lot of people within the Labor Party are very, very frustrated because Labor just waves through legislation. And to be honest, people say, that's because it's a crisis. And all I can say to that is bull. Every time the Liberals have come up with something to restrict our civil liberties, Labor pounds the drum and says, no, 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 until they wave it on through nearly unanimously almost every time, a few months later after making a big song and dance about it.
Yeah, I agree. What happens is that they cry some crocodile tears, but then actually just nod it through.
Yeah, and to be honest, I think people are getting quite sick of it. They claim we're different, and okay, I will concede that there are differences, absolutely. But the way it's perceived by the public, if you sit around in a pub or a restaurant and it's near election time, you'll hear one thing almost everywhere. They're both the bloody same.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, many people would say that. And, if you look at the policy agendas, there's a little bit of divergence, but yeah, and 80 to 90%, they're on the same side. And what's interesting now, of course, with ScoMo effectively positioning to distribute large, 16% of GDP, there's very little room for Labor now in terms of anything different. So I'm not sure what their policies will be ahead. And I guess the really interesting question is this amount of GDP that's being handed out really going to the right places? Is it going to have the right effects? And how do we roll it back afterwards? And that, to me, is the really critical question. And I know that ScoMo is talking about, we want to rebuild the economy around fast growth. I hope that doesn't mean just stimulating the property market again.
Oh, would it really surprise you? Would it really surprise
No,
any of us?
it wouldn't.
No, I don't think so.
$100,000 first owner grants coming up. I can just see it.
Oh, so can I. A few people on Twitter have been saying that for a while now. You know, the first sign of trouble, first $100,000 first homeowner grant. But I do realistically wonder how much fiscal headroom he is going to have. I think it's really going to depend on how things play out globally. You know, if we can continue to see the crisis deteriorate, and we continue to see, you know, bond yields rising, and, you know, the Fed's, you know, magic money printer, you know, finally isn't enough, then all of a sudden, you know, running 16% of GDP into a stimulus on a continuing basis isn't really all that feasible anymore, especially for a country as reliant on cyclical economic outcomes as Australia. Because I don't think that China is going to come back from this as strong as they were before, despite what is sort of coming out of the mining lobby.
Well, the GDP number from China today was strongly down, right? I think the first time for 30 years it's negative.
Yeah, I think they said since like 1970 or something. It might have been even over 30 years. Actually, it's been a long time.
Yeah, I think it was 1992, as I recall. But anyway, the point is,
oh,
you know,
yeah, no, you're right. Actually, yes.
Yeah, so 1992, and 80% of the economy now is firing in China, evidently, but they're still obviously not back to where they were. And you know, just think through a couple of the levers that we've had in the past 30 years in Australia. Strong migration, right? So we've had really big population growth. That's been really the main growth engine for Australia for at least 20 to 30 years. Migration currently, 0, right? That's not going to come back anytime soon. The other one, of course, is you know, the education sector. Well, we know that international students are you know, pretty much excluded now. You know, there might be some online stuff, but not very much. So the education sector is pretty much gone. The tourism sector is pretty much gone. I guess the miners will hope that they can start exporting more stuff, but if China doesn't fire as strongly and doesn't need so many imports to drive their effectively production systems, then the export that we actually pull out the ground may not be strongly in demand or at a good price. So you sort of stand back and think, well, hang on a moment, what growth levers do we actually have?
And I think that's one of the really key points going forward. I mean, there's a chart that Lindsay David and Philip Sue's put together at LF Economics of nominal wage growth over time, and there's this big dip during the Depression where nominal wages were declining at up to 10%, I think it was nearly up to 10% per annum. And people say, oh, you know, wages are going to go up, and I say, well, how? You know, it's all well and good for Frydenberg and Morrison and even the IMF to make all these forecasts. But the real outcomes that we're seeing, you know, the Grattan Institute is talking about 20 to 25% of jobs when they did a study earlier this month already had disappeared. We are already effectively, by that measure, near Great Depression level unemployment. You know, they talk about this recovery, and don't get me wrong, some of these jobs are going to come back very strong. You know, you're going to see some of these, you know, popular cafes, some of these popular businesses, and they're going to be right back on, and these people are going to be straight back into work. But how many of them are going to go straight back into work? You know, like I've seen some estimates out of the US suggesting as many as 2/3 of the jobs lost are not coming back in short order, that it's going to be a long slog to get them back. And how are you going to engineer wage growth if you've got 15 to 20% unemployment? You know, how are you going to engineer GDP growth? You know, how are you going to justify immigration at all, let alone 300,000 people a year? You know, you want to import even a long run average of 70,000 a year when you've got 15 to 20% unemployment. It's going to be a political nightmare. You know, the Australia that we know may be gone. You know, whether it is or not, I cannot say definitively, but in time, you know, if we do see these horrible numbers come to fruition, that world isn't coming back.
Well, what's really interesting, if you think about the way the economy works, a lot of it is driven off, you know, households consuming. About half of GDP was from consumption. Well, consumption is going to be significantly lower than it was because the job level is going to be a lot lower and income is going to be a lot lower. The other half of the growth, a lot of that came from the services sector. But of course, the services sector is just moving a dollar around the economy. It's not actually creating more stuff. It's not creating more value, as it were. So to my mind, if you really want to have a plan for future growth, you've got to think very differently about the nature of our economy. We actually think about how we're going to start making things again, bringing back some manufacturing capability and perhaps even beginning to overlay that with some thinking about, green and climate change and those new industries that could be created. Because if we try to replicate what we had before and essentially continue to be totally reliant on importing everything from, China and elsewhere, to my mind, we're going to end up with an economy that's just permanently weak.
Yeah, well, exactly. And we're going to end up with an economy that's permanently exposed to cyclical factors. And to be completely honest with you, Australia has been exposed to cyclical factors since its inception, really. Once upon a time, they said Australia's fortunes rode on the back of a sheep. Now they ride on the back of a bulk carrier. And realistically, the problem with, this sort of, like, as you say, the services economy, the big chain of money washing around the economy, is we're starting to see the links in the chain being removed. And these systems, despite the claims of politicians and otherwise, these links are not easily replaced. You pull a few links out, all of a sudden, it shrinks, there's less money flowing around. More people will then lose their jobs. More people will then close businesses, and that's the problem. That's the issue that we face, particularly here in Australia, and particularly because of JobKeeper, because all these businesses that would have fallen over, that where we would already be seeing the economy adapting and changing, and people looking for new work and new opportunities, that's not happening now. Because we've been given this false sense of security that in 6 months, what did Scott Morrison say? We're going to bridge the gap, we're going to drive over the other side, and everything's going to be fine. Now, that's not going to happen. In no universe is that going to happen. So the problem is that in 6 months' time, all these businesses that have been kept on life support and all these people who've been kept in work, but not actually working, what's going to happen? All of a sudden, all those links in the chain are just going to go. They're all going to disappear in an instant, and then all of a sudden we're going to have to contend with suddenly putting the economy back together again all at once, rather than slowly piecing it back together as it all organically failed. Now, whether that's the right option or the wrong option, I don't know. That's a little bit above my pay grade, and it's probably going to be something for some economic historian down the road. But there are costs either way, no matter what Morrison says. And while it may feel good that we can say, oh, we've only got 15% unemployment, America's got 25, Canada's got 35. At the end of the day, the real outcomes for people waiting in that Centrelink line or sitting at home on the couch watching Netflix, hoping that things go back to normal, things aren't really all that different.
Well, that's right. And it's interesting, of course, because the Roy Morgan unemployment number is at 16.8%, significant jump, whereas the official number came out at 5.2 or something, right? But that we know that was early on, and they're expecting Treasury saying, oh, it could get up to about 10. But frankly, that's all illusory, right? Because the real question is not unemployment, but it's underemployment, and we already had underemployment much higher. And my view is we've got to be looking at underemployment ahead, because that will give us a really good read as to what the real spare capacity in the economy is. And it's worth noting, by the way, that Japan came out overnight and said they are going to deliberately now build a strategy not to be as reliant on China as previously. So they're going to create diversification and to do more in and around Japan, because they think that they cannot ever go through that same total reliance to China as they have at the moment. So I think there's some really worrying but also interesting and quite intriguing opportunities coming up. But we need vision to be able to go more than just we'll ignore the last 6 months and we'll just start from the start of the year again and do everything like we used to. Ain't going to be like that.
No, absolutely not. And look, that's a really important point on Japan, and that's something that you're seeing all the way around the world. You're seeing car manufacturers in Germany talking about potentially potentially moving their supply chains elsewhere, or at the very least diversifying them throughout the world in order to not have all their eggs in one basket. And realistically, that's bad news for Australia, because as all these companies move out of China, they go to Vietnam or Bangladesh or Africa or wherever, that the explosive growth that Chinese industry has seen, that's backstopped the infrastructure boom that Australia has provided for, is no longer going to be there. Whether or not we see a sort of net outflow of industry out of China remains to be seen. I mean, whether or not the actual number that they're building is higher than the amount that's actually flowing out from foreign companies, we don't know. But it's not going to be as strong as it was before. And I look at some of the iron ore export numbers. They're not really all that different to the way things were before. China is still pricing this massive infrastructure stimulus. Yet there was a report in the South China Morning Post yesterday saying that 205 million Chinese, according to one estimate, were now unemployed. Now, I'm sorry, if that's even half true, there is no way that they can keep running an infrastructure-based economy, because they're going to have all these extra mouths to feed, people to provide for, an industry to support. And if that's the case, Australia is buggered in terms of the prices of our iron ore and the volume that we produce. I think what a lot of people don't realize is, on the long-term scale, iron ore is not an expensive commodity. If you go back to the 90s, you're talking about $20 a ton, $40 a ton. Even $40 was when China was already on the rise. And now we've seen an explosive growth in the amount that's being exported from all over the world, in Africa and Brazil and all these other sort of major iron ore producers. And if China goes off the boil, I've seen some analysts say that iron ore could go back to $15 to $20 a ton. And if that happens, it's going to blow a hole in the side of the budget to the tune of 10, 15, $20 billion a year. There's half the defense budget gone.
Yeah, well, and of course, the critical issue there is that if we don't get the company tax flowing, we don't get the household consuming, GST, and then people aren't employed as much, so they don't pay as much in income tax, then the government coffers are going to be very much up against it. And then, of course, that takes you to how much of a deficit can you run, for how long, and do you actually try and pay it back or not? I mean, those are really big, existential questions, really, for the shape of the economy ahead.
Yeah, and I think that, ironically, Australia has put itself in a rather bad position. Not just because we've created an incredibly China-reliant and cyclical factor-reliant economy, but just even from a political perspective. We have tied the wagon to China. America has been pissed off with us for a long, long time. There's an excerpt from a book from an ANU professor and he says he was talking to a State Department official, and he said the State Department official said to him, "You Australians always claim that you don't need to choose between China and America," and he's like, "That's a load of crap. You need to choose, and you need to choose us." And as China weakens, you're going to start to see that become more and more of a factor. America reasserting itself, the sort of Trumpian foreign policy coming to the fore. And the support that we did have from China in terms of propping up our property, propping up our industry, and all those sorts of different factors is not going to come in the same sort of volume from the US and from our other allies as the world does change.
No, that's true. And then I think overlay one more factor, and we know that, for example, the bad debts are already rising in the US, so the financial system over there is under pressure. There were some provisions made by JP Morgan and Wells Fargo, which were higher than people expected, but they're still only around 2% relative to 6%, which is what the hit was during the GFC, so there's a lot more to go there. We know that bad debts are rising in China, so essentially because of the higher unemployment in China, some of the financial system over there is under pressure. And we know here in Australia, our financial system is under some pressure. Okay, it's been supported very strongly by the RBA and by the other initiatives and cheap funding and those sorts of things, but the banking system here is also going to be under pressure too. So essentially the underlying financial infrastructure around the world is also in a significant state of disrepair and is likely to become even more dysfunctional ahead. And so, as well as the real economy and the issues about where growth is coming from, you've got the financial system also looking pretty shaky too. So, that's another factor you've got to play into this scenario to understand where we're going. And like I say, I think we have to be charting a different path forward. We can't go back and just say, oh, let's just do more debt. Not sure that's going to work, or let's just sell more iron ore to whoever. No, we need a rather different way of thinking about the future to be able to take us to a rather different place. And that's down to real leadership and real vision. Q who, I guess, is my question.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't know. No, seriously, realistically, you look at the ranks of the Liberal Party, you look at the ranks of the Labor Party, there's not really a whole lot of appetite for that sort of vision of the future. It's a very much a maintenance of the status quo. And I think just on the subject of politics, I think that we're going to see a very much a turn towards nationalism, towards patriotism, and I think there's going to be growing anti-China sentiment, especially as the sort of Trump narrative and the sort of escaped virus narrative continues to be perpetrated. Whether it's true or not, and that's immaterial to the way it's going to be perceived. And I don't think that Scott Morrison is equipped to deal with that world, both the world that we're describing in terms of the financial and economic issues, but even in terms of the changing political landscape. Scott Morrison is not the kind of sort of nationalistic, chest-thumping, anti-China leader. He's been far more. He's acquiesced to China for far more than that. I mean, we had the Chinese fleet sail into Sydney Harbour on the 30th anniversary of Tiananmen Square. That was a nice little touch. Everyone waking up to Chinese warships flying their flags in the harbour without ever being told about it. Great work, ScoMo. Nicely done. I'm sure the people who escaped from the Cultural Revolution here were really happy to see that. And that's why I think that in a lot of ways, unless Morrison can really significantly change his persona and the way he goes about things, his days are numbered. I'm not talking about in the short term, but in the longer term. Whether he loses in an election or whether he gets replaced, he needs to change tack, and he needs to realize that a lot of these changes that I'm talking about in terms of the nationalism, in terms of the anti-China sentiment, if you talk to rank and file members of the Liberal Party and of the right in Australia, they have been there for quite a while now. People have been concerned about foreign ownership of key assets, foreign ownership of key businesses, foreign ownership of residential property. All these things have been key problems from rank and file members of the Liberal Party for a long, long time. Now, the calls of this are going to get even louder, because now even the small business owners who used to support population QE and pro-China are going to be flipping, because there's not going to be any incentive to support that anymore. So the Liberal Party has changed and the political landscape has changed. And to be honest, I wouldn't be surprised if in the coming years, if Dutton ends up being PM, because he's one of the few people who was actually wholeheartedly, unabashedly nationalistic and anti-China, and he's been that way since the beginning. And he's one of the few people who can do it with any level of sincerity. Now, whether you like Dutton or not is obviously another question, and a lot of people don't. But that is the kind of politician that the situation is going to start demanding. And to be completely honest, Albo doesn't fit the bill either. No one on the Labor front bench really fulfills that chest-thumping, nationalistic sort of fervor that you need in this sort of situation to really charismatically unite the country and to get people to come together, because that's what needs to happen. Now, you don't need to necessarily be that kind of person. You could be a Churchill, you can be a Roosevelt, you can be soft-spoken, but I don't think anyone really has the chops for that.
Right. And so do you think neoliberalism then is dead? Is that what you're really saying?
I would say it is effectively, yes. I think that the world has moved on from that. The world has changed. You look at the Liberal Party. Did you ever think that a few weeks ago, we were still arguing over a $75 a week increase to New Star. They've now they've now effectively doubled it. Good luck ever getting that back, by the way. Good luck turning that off. And there's been an enormous change. Now, I know for a fact from what I've heard, Scott Morrison is not terribly happy with this. He wants to put things back the way they were as soon as possible, because he's ideologically opposed to this. He wants to put things back the way they were. He wants very, very clear limits in place. Like, he keeps ramming home. He keeps saying these financial support measures are for 6 months. The job keeper, job seeker bonus, all 6 months, despite the fact that job keepers legislated for 18 months. But we'll leave that out of the equation. But the thing is, you can't turn it off when you've switched it on in the middle of a crisis with double-digit unemployment. And that's going to be one of the really, really key things going forward, because Australia has been fiscally responsible by rating agency standards for a long time. Now the AAA is under threat. Well, I think the last thing said 1 in 3 chance of losing it. But when it becomes clear that they can't turn this off, that things are going to be like this to some degree for the foreseeable future, well, I mean, what happens to Australia's borrowing costs as this crisis begins to unfold? I mean, there was a fantastic chart from the RBA recently showing bond spreads between onshore borrowing and offshore borrowing for the banks. And the bond spreads for offshore borrowing absolutely skyrocketed. The spread almost doubled within a few weeks. And what's going to happen when it becomes clear that, one, things are not going to go back to normal? The government is going to have to keep some of these policies in place for the foreseeable future, and that our economy is no longer as secure as it once was, and neither is the revenue base that supports that rating. I mean, I don't know what happens to our borrowing costs in that situation. I mean, you've probably got a better idea than I do, I would imagine.
Well, it rather depends on what happens in other countries too, right? Because if everybody's going down the same path, then effectively you march together. But if you start getting differential recoveries in different parts of the world, that's when we could have huge pressures on our local currency, and therefore borrowing costs could definitely be significantly higher. And the RBA will do what they can to try and sort of control the local environment. But the international financial markets are way bigger than our muscle. And therefore, there's a limit ultimately to how we can traverse that. Look, my own view is there's definitely a scenario where there is an inflationary future, but I actually think that the one which is most likely is the depressionary, recessionary future. And there, in fact, borrowing costs will stay low because economic activity will continue to be low. But that means that wages will be dropping rather than rising. And effectively we will see many of those leading indicators of depressionary functionality in the economy running for quite some time. And that is going to be a whole new world, and it's not one that I want to embrace particularly, but I fear that could be where we end up.
In terms of borrowing costs, I've been thinking that a lot of countries have retirement systems whereby they have a system in place that they need, that the pension funds need to purchase a certain percentage of government bonds. Now, I was wondering what your thoughts are in terms of basically the government running enormous deficits for the foreseeable future, sort of enormous, and then them being backstopped.
US style deficits.
Yeah, US style deficits for the foreseeable future. Yeah.
Yep.
And then those being backstopped by the government forcing super funds to buy a greater proportion of government bonds. Is that something that you could see happening?
Well, what you can absolutely see is essentially the two sides going bigger, right? So basically, you print more money and you issue more bonds, and those bonds get bought by people, be it super funds or be it by the Reserve Bank or whoever. So basically, both sides go higher, right? So the numbers get bigger. Now, obviously, what happens then is you get the value of real money goes down because effectively there's all money in the circulation, but it's for the same quality of assets. So that's the first issue. The second issue there, though, is that it's very hard to unwind that. And if you look at what's happened with the US, the Fed's now at $6 trillion. If you look at their balance sheet, $6 trillion. It's gone up by something like 12 to 18% in a few weeks, right? Those numbers get to the point where it's almost impossible to unwind it. And therefore it becomes part of the furniture. but essentially it doesn't necessarily create productive output. And the worry I have is you end up then trying to fix the financial system, and in the process of that, you forget about the real economy and real people and real businesses. And that is where the Fed is at the moment. So the Fed's trying to fix the financial system. Meanwhile, on Main Street, you've got, 20 million people in the US now unemployed, some, remarkable number, and rising. It's, like I said, a whole new world. It's not one that I particularly want, but I think we're going to get served it.
Yeah, it's quite crazy, and a lot of those numbers in the US as well are actually outdated, because the problem is that the American system of unemployment, unlike Australia where you can just log into Centrelink and apply, a lot of American states still require you to either fill in physical paperwork or make a phone call. Now there have been stories in the US media of people having to call about over 1,000 times in New York State in order to get through. Now, in Pennsylvania, which has the ability to lodge a claim online and is considered one of the most efficient unemployment offices in the US, unemployment there is somewhere pushing almost 27% already. And that's an absolutely insane number. And believe it or not, they actually have a daily unemployment figure. You can get the number of jobs that have been lost in a day, literally 24 hours after. I mean, people make fun of the Americans, your systems are all crap, they're all antiquated, and here we are operating on the ABS data that's that's over a month old and basically useless. But more to the point, I've been going through some of the data, and in Pennsylvania, still almost 0.5% of the labor force are losing their job still to this day, every single day. It's slowing down, but it's not stopping. They've already exceeded, the highs of the Great Depression. And, even if we manage to get half these people back to work, even if we get 75% of them back to work, the unemployment is going to be so huge. I don't know how America's going to manage it, especially because they've spent all these trillions and trillions of dollars on bailouts and Wall Street and backstopping, junk bonds and all this other crap.
Well, there's the old saying, in a crisis, you take the escalator down, but unfortunately you have to take the stairs up. And so while the escalator might drop quite quickly, the journey back up the stairs is a lot longer, slower, and can take many years. And that's why I ultimately think that we are about to enter a very concerning, a new phase in terms of, our local economy and the US economy too. This is, unheard of change. And I suspect you and I will be talking about this for a little bit further down the track, Tarric, as things continue to wind or unwind, depending on how you look at it.
I'm sure we will, mate. And I'm sure we're going to keep seeing the Fed do all sorts of stupid things, and I think they're just going to keep saying to the people on Main Street, well, just let them eat cake.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because every time the Fed does something, they directly link it to households and businesses, as though somehow what they're doing is connected to those households and businesses. But the truth is, of course, it's not. It's to support basically the financial system and all those big corporations and everybody else. And meanwhile, in the real world, people are still struggling with higher levels of unemployment and very, very unfortunate prospects for the future. We are in most interesting times, to quote your proverb from the other day.
We certainly are, mate. It's quite crazy listening to some of these Fed officials say, oh, but we're doing this to save people's 401ks and their retirement savings. I'm just sitting there thinking, well, what's the point of having a 401k if you don't have a job or a house? 30% unemployment? Jesus.
Yeah, no, I agree. Tarric, I appreciate your time today. Very interesting times, and I'm sure we will come back and have another chat very soon. Take care.
You too, mate. Bye.
Cheers.